At 79 years old, Dolly Parton has built a legacy wrapped in rhinestones, resilience, and a radiant smile that rarely hints at the pain behind it. For decades, she stayed silent about the betrayal that almost broke her spirit. But now, she's finally naming the man who shattered her trust. And to the shock of many, that name is Elvis Presley. But he wasn't the only one. In a world where men held the contracts and called the shots, Dolly was expected to play along, smile pretty, and give up her power. What started as a dream duet with the king of rock and roll ended in one of the most heartbreaking decisions of her career, one that would haunt her and define her legacy. For the first time, Dolly is telling the full truth about the men who tried to steal her voice and the moment she chose to fight back. What she reveals about Elvis and the others will change how you see her forever. And what happens next rewrites country music history. Dolly Parton's betrayal by Elvis Presley wasn't a tabloid scandal. It was quieter than that. It happened behind closed doors, in hushed negotiations, and it hit her where it hurt most: her music, her independence, and her soul. In the early 1970s, Dolly had just released "I Will Always Love You," a song written during one of the most painful times in her life, the end of her professional partnership with Porter Wagoner. That song, born out of heartbreak and personal sacrifice, was climbing the charts when Dolly received a call that felt like a dream. Elvis Presley wanted to record it. For a girl from the Smoky Mountains who grew up idolizing him, it felt like a sign from heaven. Dolly said yes, without hesitation. The thought of Elvis singing her lyrics was thrilling beyond words, but when the contracts arrived, her excitement turned to devastation. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, demanded that in order for Elvis to record the song, he would need to own half of the publishing rights. It was a standard deal Parker made with nearly every songwriter Elvis worked with. But Dolly wasn't just any songwriter. She had fought for every inch of success she had, and she knew the value of her words. Giving up half of that song would mean giving away her future. And so, with a heavy heart, Dolly told them no. She walked away from what could have been the biggest opportunity of her career, not out of pride, but out of principle. And Elvis never recorded the song. It broke her heart, not just because of the missed opportunity, but because of the way it made her feel, like just another woman expected to hand over her art to a man with more power. Dolly later admitted she cried all night after turning the deal down. Elvis never called her, never reached out to say he understood, and though she continued to admire him, that wound never fully healed. It wasn't just about Elvis. In that moment she realized something deeper, that even her heroes could become her betrayers. And this was just the beginning. Dolly Parton never forgot the moment she had to say no to Elvis Presley. She was barely into her 30s, still proving herself as a solo artist after years tethered to Porter Wagoner's show. She'd already endured years of being treated like a sidekick, praised for her voice, yes, but constantly underestimated for her mind. And now, with "I Will Always Love You" gaining traction, she finally had something that was hers, a song that marked her freedom. So, when Colonel Tom Parker demanded half of it, it wasn't just a business decision, it was a test of her identity. But walking away from Elvis wasn't the last time Dolly would feel that sting of betrayal. In fact, it wouldn't even be the worst. Because as her career soared and she broke into the mainstream, more men in the industry tried to box her in, use her, and take what wasn't theirs. One of them was her former partner, Porter Wagoner. Though they had years of musical success together, behind the scenes, the relationship had grown toxic. Porter wanted control over the show, over the songs, and at times, over Dolly herself. When she told him she was leaving to pursue her own career, he fought back hard. He even sued her for $3 million, claiming breach of contract and damages. The lawsuit dragged on for years and was settled quietly, but the pain remained. To this day, Dolly describes that chapter of her life as one of the hardest. She wrote, "I will always love you," for Porter, but even that wasn't enough to ease the fallout. The men she trusted most, Elvis, Porter, had both tried to take ownership of something she had created from her own pain. And in both cases, she stood her ground, but not without a cost. The industry kept testing her. Record labels tried to steer her toward pop music completely, thinking her country roots weren't profitable enough. Executives told her to change her look, to tone down the glitz and glamour. One even told her, "You'll never be taken seriously looking like that." But Dolly never changed. She kept the wigs, the rhinestones, and the southern twang, and she proved every one of them wrong. Every man who underestimated her would eventually watch her rise from the sidelines, stunned. And still, the betrayal by Elvis lingered the longest. Because she didn't just admire him, she loved him. Not romantically, but spiritually, as an artist, as a fellow Southern kid who had made it big. She wanted to believe they were cut from the same cloth. But the deal proved otherwise. Globalization. Parton was 30 years old when she made one of the most difficult decisions of her life, saying no to Elvis Presley. And it wasn't because she didn't admire him. In fact, she adored him. Wasn't just a singer to Dolly. He was a symbol of Southern power, someone who took country and gospel roots and turned them into something the entire world couldn't ignore. When she heard that he wanted to record "I Will Always Love You," her heart nearly stopped. It felt like destiny. But what came next shattered that dream. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's infamous manager, had one condition. Elvis wouldn't record the song unless they received 50% of the publishing rights. Dolly sat with the offer. She cried over it. She called her advisors, her lawyers, and even her pastor. But no matter how she looked at it, it just didn't sit right. "That song was my life story," Dolly later said in interviews. "Giving that away would have meant giving away a piece of my soul." It would have made her rich, even richer than she already was becoming. Having Elvis Presley record your song in 1974 was like being handed the keys to the kingdom. But Dolly didn't bite. She walked away. "It broke my heart," she admitted. "I cried all night. I wanted to hear him sing it so bad. But I had to stand up for myself." And in doing so, she changed the rules for every woman who came after her. But the heartbreak didn't end with Elvis. Over the years, Dolly would see other men try to chip away at her success. Some were subtle, executives who said she was too flashy, or too country, or too blonde to be taken seriously. Others were more direct. One producer in the late 80s tried to shelve one of her albums because it wasn't sexy enough to compete with the pop charts. He told her to update her image or risk fading out. Dolly refused and released the album anyway. It didn't top the charts, but it reminded her that success wasn't just about sales. It was about staying true to who she was. That act of defiance echoed the Elvis moment all over again. She'd loved him, looked up to him, dreamed of hearing him sing her words. But at the end of the day, Dolly Parton loved herself more. And she would spend the rest of her career proving why that choice was the right one. As Dolly Parton grew older, the betrayals didn't stop. They just changed faces. In her 40s, she began noticing a disturbing pattern in the music industry. People who once praised her for her authenticity suddenly wanted her to conform. Major television producers told her she needed to tone it down. Radio executives hinted that her voice was out of style. Even collaborators who once called her a genius began treating her like a relic. It was subtle at first, meetings she wasn't invited to, projects she wasn't consulted on. But Dolly, now in her prime, saw it for what it was. They were trying to erase me quietly, some of her best late career songs. And she kept showing up, not to prove anything to others, but to herself. Still, the wounds left by men she trusted lingered. One of her longtime producers sold master recordings of her early demo tapes without her knowledge. A male agent, who once promised to protect her image, leaked private letters to the press. Even some fellow country artists she had supported for decades began excluding her from key projects. Once the industry started shifting toward a younger, more radio-friendly crowd. And through it all, the shadow of Elvis remained. Dolly never publicly blamed him, she admired him to the end, but she always carried the weight of what might have been. In recent years, as she began reflecting more openly, she admitted the real pain wasn't Elvis himself. It was the system around him, she said. Colonel Parker, the industry folks. They saw songs like Property, not as somebody's story. And Elvis, he trusted them more than he trusted his own heart. That line hit deep for Dolly, because all her life she had trusted her own heart. And while it had cost her relationships, money, and even fame at times, it had given her something greater: peace. The kind of peace that comes from never selling your soul, not to a record label, not to a manager, and not even to the king of rock and roll. By the time Dolly Parton turned 50, she had survived nearly every kind of betrayal an artist could face: broken contracts, stolen royalties, tabloid lies, and even false friends. Yet somehow, her heart remained open. In her own words, "I've been stabbed in the back so many times, it's a wonder I don't whistle when I turn around." But there was one betrayal that always lingered, one that didn't come from a contract or a crooked manager. It came from someone she once called a brother in music: Porter Wagoner. Their partnership in the late 1960s had catapulted Dolly into the spotlight. On stage, they were a perfect pair. His rugged charisma and her radiant vulnerability created magic. But offstage, their relationship was complicated. Porter was controlling, jealous, and fiercely territorial. Dolly once said, "Porter didn't want me to fly, not because he didn't think I could, but because he was afraid of being left behind." And when she finally left his show to pursue her solo career, he sued her. Not quietly either. The lawsuit made headlines and cast a shadow over everything she'd worked for. Even though they eventually reconciled before his death in 2007, Dolly never forgot the pain. In a later interview, she admitted, "I loved Porter, I really did. But love doesn't mean letting someone clip your wings." It was the kind of betrayal that went deeper than money. It was emotional, it was personal, and it taught her a hard lesson: that not every person who lifts you up wants. Fame grew. So did the envy around her. Backroom whispers turned into boardroom sabotage. She was dropped from key projects, blocked from industry awards, and even mocked by younger artists who didn't understand her impact. But instead of growing bitter, Dolly leaned into kindness. She gave opportunities to other women, often behind the scenes. She helped launch the careers of artists who reminded her of her younger self. Bold, brilliant, and underestimated. Still, there was one betrayal she never spoke of until recently. A powerful Nashville executive had once cornered her early in her career and made her feel unsafe. She never named him, never filed a lawsuit, but the memory haunted her. It was the moment she realized that her beauty, her body, and her talent were all things others thought they could take or control. And from that day forward, she vowed to never let anyone define her path again. Not even Elvis, not even Porter, not even Nashville itself. In her 60s, Dolly Parton began entering a new era, not of reinvention but of reclamation. She wasn't chasing hits anymore. She was chasing truth. And as the spotlight shifted to newer stars, Dolly didn't fade, she sharpened. While many artists softened with age, Dolly became more direct, more reflective, and more willing to expose the cracks beneath her rhinestone smile. Interviews began to hint at the weight she had carried for decades. "People see the wigs, the makeup, the glitter," she once said, "but they don't always see the scars underneath." At this stage of her life, Dolly began naming things for what they were, especially the betrayals that shaped her. And while she continued to speak fondly of Elvis Presley as an artist, she no longer danced around the truth of what happened. "Elvis didn't fight for me," she told one close friend. "He could have, but he didn't. He let Colonel Parker speak for him." That wound never fully healed. It wasn't about the money, or even the song. It was about the silence. Dolly had hoped Elvis would come to her, man to woman, artist to artist, and say, "This is your song. Let me sing it right." But instead, the king bowed to business. No hate in her heart. "I forgave him long ago," she said softly, "but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding and learning what not to do to the next person who looks up to you." During these years, Dolly also began revealing other betrayals, ones that came from close collaborators and trusted advisors. A male business manager mismanaged her finances in the early 2000s, costing her a small fortune. A PR rep sold a private story to the tabloids without her consent. Even within her beloved Dollywood team, she discovered individuals who had profited behind her back. But instead of lawsuits and scorched earth campaigns, Dolly responded with quiet exits and powerful mentored new voices. She built her empire all over again, this time with bricks she laid herself. And in the midst of this rebuilding, Dolly also returned to her roots. She began writing more, journaling, looking back at old photos and letters. And in doing so, she rediscovered the woman she was before the betrayals. The girl from Sevier County, the songwriter who believed a good lyric could outlive anything. And she realized something. The greatest revenge wasn't success or survival. It was truth. Telling her story, on her terms, without anyone else's approval, not Elvis's, not Porter's, not Nashville's, just hers. As Dolly entered her 70s, she began to drop the glitter just enough to let the truth shimmer through. Not all at once, never in an exposé or a headline-grabbing memoir, but in fragments, in interviews, in lyrics, in brief quiet moments where she let her voice tremble just a little. And what she revealed, piece by piece, was a life not just defined by rhinestones and records, but by betrayal, resilience, and reckoning. The world still saw the icon, the towering hair, the hourglass figure, the 1,000-watt smile. But behind it was a woman who had been burned by many of the men she once trusted most. One of those betrayals came from a young songwriter she had championed in the early 2000s. He had come to her with admiration in his eyes and promises of loyalty. Dolly took him under her wing, invited him to write with her, brought him into private sessions, and then watched as he stole entire verses and pitched them to bigger artists behind her back. She didn't sue, she didn't name him, but she cut him out of her life entirely. "When someone shows you who they are," she later told a friend, "believe them the first time." But for every man who let her down, there were others who showed her that love, loyalty, and decency still existed. Kenny Rogers had never betrayed her, only honored her, supported her, and loved her like a brother. She once said, "Kenny never asked for more than I could give. He saw me, not the star, not the body, me." When Kenny passed away in 2020, Dolly grieved not just the man, but the rare kind of friendship that had become nearly extinct in her world. One based on mutual respect, not ego. One that asked for nothing and offered everything. And then came another reflection. The decades-long tension with Johnny Cash's camp. While she had always respected Johnny's artistry, she had kept her distance from his inner circle, especially after learning that certain individuals close to him had allegedly blocked her from key opportunities in the late 1970s. Dolly never confirmed names, but fans noticed her absence from some of Cash's larger collaborations and tributes. It wasn't just but of how she had chosen every single time not to become them. She didn't harden, she didn't retaliate. She wrote, she created, she endured. And that, perhaps, is the greatest revenge. At 79 years old, Dolly Parton is no longer protecting anyone's legacy but her own. In a rare and emotional moment, during a private interview for an upcoming documentary, she finally put it into words, what she'd held back for nearly half a century. "Elvis betrayed me," she said. Her voice didn't tremble, and she didn't say it with anger. She said it with clarity, with the full weight of memory. He had a chance to stand with me, to stand up for me, and he didn't. He let someone else make the call, and that told me everything I needed to know. The betrayal wasn't about ownership of "I will always love you." It wasn't even about money. It was about power, about being silenced, about watching a man she idolized allow someone else to erase her role in her own creation. She had hoped Elvis would be different. He, too, had been used, manipulated, cornered by the industry. She thought he'd understand, but he didn't. Or maybe he chose not to. But what hurt more than the betrayal itself was how many people, especially men in the business, sided with him. "I remember hearing whispers," she said, "that I was difficult, that I was arrogant, just for saying no, just for wanting to keep my own song." Nashville turned cold on her for a while. The Opry cooled, her phone rang less. And yet, she kept rising. Dolly refused to become bitter, and that is perhaps her most miraculous act. She did not let betrayal define her. Instead, she turned it into fuel. And it wasn't just Elvis. She began naming, in private at first, the other men who tried to control, rewrite, or diminish her. Studiaco head in the 80s who pressured her to go full pop and threatened to cancel her contract. Windshield, a talk show host who touched her without consent backstage. A record executive who told her she'd be forgotten in 5 years if she didn't play nice. She remembered every name, but she also remembered her choice, to outlast them all. And she did. Parton owns her songs, her brand, her likeness, and her legacy. She is one of the wealthiest and most beloved entertainers on the planet, not because she betrayed others, but because she refused to betray herself. Her words about Elvis in that documentary weren't meant to cancel him. They were meant to free herself. "I'll always love the music, and I'll always wonder what could have been. But I don't wonder who I am anymore. I know." Retains, and just like that, after decades of silence, Dolly Parton finally gave the world her truest,